Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today. We are continuing with our reading of Hannah Arendt's book, Between Past and Future, and particularly with this second very complicated, somewhat dense, and yet I think also crucially important essay, The Concept of History, Ancient and Modern. Um, and last time we met 2 weeks ago, uh, we talked a lot about the ancient and modern, how Arendt distinguishes these two concepts of history, one being the ancient concept of history, which is one that deals with the deeds themselves. The premise of the ancient concept of history is that there's single deeds or instances or gestures, and that these are extraordinary. And the task of the poet or the historiographer, whether it's Homer or Herodotus, is to remember these deeds because they deserve to be remembered. There's an obvious sense that that the deeds of people deserve to be remembered, or at least the deeds of some people do. And then history is the remembering of great deeds. Modern history, if you'll recall, arises from the 16th and 17th century development of the natural sciences, and is primarily influenced by what Arendt calls the world alienation of man as a basic condition of our whole life, that we turn away from the world, the deeds, the acts of individuals, and not and first you could say turn away to God, right? That's a Christian world alienation. But in the secular world alienation, we don't turn away from the world to the world, right? This is Arendt's understanding of the misunderstanding of the process of secularization. Secularization doesn't turn us towards the world. It actually turns us away from the world and inside us into theories and reason, and this subjectivization of knowledge through the idea that we can only know what we can make ourselves or what we can think. We can't actually know the Ding an sich, the world in itself, in a Kantian sense, and thus we are plunged into Cartesian doubt. And the only way we have of securing certainty in the world is through developing human theories, processes that tell that in a sense tell the story and make the world meaningful, not starting with the deeds and remembering them, but starting with a coherent, rational process in our heads, and then finding the deeds in the world to show that that is the process of the way things are. It's a reversal. And this is what she calls world alienation, a turning away from the world into ourselves, a radical subjectivization, in which not only is nature, in the sense of the thing in itself, we no longer have access to it. We only can know its way it is known by us in our reason, but history too is de-objectified. Things are made into simply parts of a story that we tell, and so that's sort of the work of the first 15 or 20 pages of this chapter that we read and talked about in the last session. Today we're going to talk about politics and why this world alienation, the subjectivization of knowledge, and the transformation of history away from objective deeds and gestures and acts and into a story that we tell, in a sense, a story of history that we may think makes sense, and thus a scientific account of history, right? And this is the Marxian element, but it's not just Marx. It's the whole modern uh, uh, historiographic movement, which thinks that history should make sense, that history should have a logic to it, and this desire to make the world logical, the historical world logical, means that we prioritize the story over the facts, and this, of course, leads to the defactualization, the de-objectivization of the world in a way that uh, opens the door to totalitarianism. Is certainly one way to think about this, and that Arendt talks about near the end of this chapter, because what totalitarianism needs is the ability to impose on the incredible plurality and multiplicity of incoherent and often chaotic facts in the world a single story. And once you can do that, once you have this ability to take all these different things and find the consistent logical story, you can then say that's the story of the world, whether it's the Bolshevik story, right? That the world is told through the story of class struggle, leading to a dictatorship of the proletariat, leading to a communist utopia, or whether your story is a Nazi story of the world is the story of the conflict of the races and the superiority of the Aryan race over all others, primarily the Jewish race, and the need to prove the superiority of the Aryan race by eliminating the Jewish race from the world and allowing the Aryan race to conquer the world. That's another story. But there are other stories we could tell, right? A story of um, environmentalism. That the story is, it could be one of anthropocentrism, right? The man's destiny to rule the world, or an Earth-centric version, which is that in the end, man has to succumb to the powers of nature and the earth, and in a sense, potentially be eliminated in order to preserve nature and the inviolability of nature. All of these are potential stories that we can tell, and that we can impose fact patterns on in the world in order to tell the story. Sometimes we would then need to eliminate inconvenient facts in a way to make our story more believable, and that's the danger of terror and violence that comes into totalitarianism. That's an overarching global view of this chapter, but let me turn back to page 71, which is about the midpoint of the essay. We're about where we stopped last time. And on page 71, Arendt begins talking again about the idea of immortality. And immortality is a central idea in her essay, because the Greeks saw man as the mortal in a world of populated by gods that were immortal and animals that were immortal, because animals were species beings and they lived circularly, right? You may die, but your species lives. There's no mortality for animals because they're part of a species that lives on. Only the humans, for the Greeks, were mortal in the sense that when they died, their story ends as individuals. And yet the Greeks thought that the goal of human life was to elevate themselves above their mortal nature, to be like gods, to be immortal. And there were different ways to do that. She says there are three forms of immortality on the bottom of page 71. One is to become immortal through famous deeds. So if you're Hector or Achilles, you act in ways, or if you're Pericles, you act in ways that people remember you because of your deeds. Another is that you can create works that are remembered and that become part of the world. So Homer would be an example of that. And then there's philosophers who seek to become immortal by leaving the world and living in a world of ideas or eternal world. And since the world of ideas that Plato discovers are unending and immortal, they can create an immortal world through their philosophy. In all of these ideas of immortality, immortality is an activity, right? It's something you do. It's a deed. It's the creation of a work, or it's uh, um, development of a system of ideas. And in that sense, immortality requires a politics. It requires a space, an imperishable space that guarantees that the immortalizing deed will be remembered and thus not be in vain. And this is where politics comes in, because politics is the creation of a polis, which is this imperishable space, this space that lasts over and over, whether it's the Athenian polis or the Roman Republic or the American democracy. The idea is that the stories of George Washington or Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King Jr., those acts will become immortal because they're part of a space that will last, a political space that will last forever. And thus the drive towards immortality is at the foundation of Greek political thought. In the modern age, however, and this is where Arendt begins to tell her story of the concept of history, ancient and modern, the new secularism, right? So again, I talked about how the Greeks were concerned with the world, the Christians went up to God and to the afterlife, and now secularism turns us back to the world, we're told, but it doesn't turn us back to the world. It turns us back internally to man, the subject, and to reason. New secularism returned man to a mortality, whereas the Christians saw our soul as immortal. We now said, no, we're just mortal beings. We're going to die. But we no longer had faith in a permanent space of politics, a permanent, imperishable space, as I was talking about before. And so without this faith in the permanence of the world, we now are in a situation where not only is life perishable, which has always been the case because we're mortals, right? And we're going to die, but the world in which we live with others is perishable, mortal, and futile, because we don't, we become separate from the world. We become internal. We think of reason as maybe eternal, but nothing as immortal in the world. And we become convinced that the world will perish, or at least everything that's in it now will perish, and it will be superseded by a new utopia, a new end. We become accustomed, Arendt says, to this absolute mortality. It doesn't bother us. The Greeks couldn't take it. They thought that given the mortality of man, we needed to create public spaces where we would become immortal. She says we don't have that sense of public immortality. And so but it's still a problem. And what replaces the political aim of immortality, the political aim to move us from being mortal to immortal, is history. And so on page 75, she will write that history comes to replace the immortality of life of our world. But no longer is the immortality that history gives us the immortality of a deed of mortal men, right? It is now a process that is independent of cities, states, nations, and it encompasses the whole of mankind. And so it's a kind of world history. Man becomes more like an animal who has a species being, and his immortality comes not from what he or she does, the way he lives or she lives in the world, but from the process. And so this leads us into the last major section of this essay, which she titles History and Politics, and which begins on page 76. And the argument here in this section is that history instead of uh, um, either religion or instead of deeds or instead of works. History now is what bestows new meaning and significance upon men's deeds and sufferings on earth. The basic idea here is an old one, that uh, human life can be miserable and can be painful and can be absolutely unbearable. And in the end, what makes it bearable is meaning, right? Is that somehow we feel that our life has purpose or meaning. And the modern way of giving ourselves meaning is not God or religion. It's not being famous in a politics. It's about being part of a historical process. Um, so, if you think about, I was thinking a lot about Arthur Kessler's work, Darkness at Noon, last weekend when I was at a conference up at Skidmore. And in that work, the main character, Rubashov, is concerned at all first as a good communist. He doesn't care about his life. He's framed. He's put on a show trial, and the question is, should he admit that he was a traitor to Stalin, and and say that he was standing against the onslaught of communist history, which he didn't do, or should he hold out for the truth and his dignity? And the book is a contest between the dignity of an individual and the meaning of an individual that is found in being part of a movement or a process. And this is what Arendt is talking about. For her, modern politics is not about what's happened. It's not about facts. It's not about the world. It's about a future-oriented movement to some end goal. And obviously, Marx is a touchstone here, although she doesn't at all limit this to Marx. So Marx turns the Hegelian truth of history, which is seen in the backward glance of the philosopher, and tries to make sense of the world, right? The owl of Minerva only spreads its wings at the dawning of the dusk. We only can understand what has happened after it's happened, and we look back on it with a rational gaze and make sense of it, right? That was the Hegelian philosophy of history, that looking back on history with a rationalist gaze, we can make sense of history. Marx stands that on its head, turns it around, and seeks to make sense not only of the backward glance, but of a forward glance, right? That we can, if we understand the dialectic of history and understand that class struggle is the motor of history in the dialectic, we not only can understand how things have happened up till now, but we can say, it's leading towards an inevitable end, right? When classes will be dissolved and the working class, everyone will be equal and will live in a communist utopia. And so the Marxist inversion of the Hegelian philosophy of history means that we have a desire to make history, to bring history to an end, to a utopia, to a communist utopia. And thus, she'll say on page 78, that Marx's political thinking is based not on acting men, right? It's not based on what people do. It's based on a theory of history. It's based on this rationalist knowledge of where things should go based on our rationalist account of the process of history. And there's a danger here, right, that Arendt is deeply aware of. The danger is that in transforming unknown, small, chaotic, random acts of men into simply data points on a planned and willed process, theoretical tangent of history, it means that the meaning of history, the meaning of humanity, is encompassed not in the acts we do, but in the ends. The meaning of world history for Marx is a communist utopia. The meaning of world history for Adolf Hitler is a Third Reich, an Aryan rule, right? The meaning is in the ends. And that means that all the actions are transformed into simply stepping stones to the end. Um, and and so for her on page 78, she can write, neither freedom nor any other meaning can ever be the product of a human activity in the sense in which a table is clearly the end product of a carpenter's activity. What she means by that is that a carpenter wants to take wood and nails and whatever other he's using and make it into a table. The table is the end. The wood has meaning insofar as it's a table. What Arendt wants to say is that humans and free human beings can't be like wood. They can't be simply only useful insofar as they lead to a communist utopia. The Marxian idea, though, de-objectifies individual humans. It tells them that they're only useful insofar as they contribute to the coming Marxist utopia. And thus, it's okay to kill 6 million kulaks and peasants because they're sacrificing themselves for a better end. Or it's okay to kill the bourgeoisie. Or it's okay to kill loyal comrades who you've spent years fighting in the revolution with because you need an enemy in order to keep people believing in the communist struggle. And that was the show trials for Stalin. And so for Arendt, this turning of meaning into ends is an erasure of human dignity and human freedom. And if you're, and I mentioned it a second ago, but if you do want to ever read a novel that articulates this struggle between meaning of man caught up in the ends and the struggle towards an end, like the communist movement, versus man as an individual with dignity, someone who is being sacrificed to that end and struggling with whether they should let themselves be sacrificed because they want to see themselves as meaningful, or they should resist. Arthur Koestler's book Darkness at Noon is probably the greatest book on that particular dialectic ever written. Another one, if you're interested, is Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which is on a very different level and in a very different context, a book about a man trying to live a dignified life outside of different movements, which would give his life meaning. And I think that's why I think that's the greatest American novel ever written, and worth paying attention to. Anyway, for Arendt here, for meaning was what once arose out of human deeds. It was the flower on the bud, as it were, that comes out of it, and it's thus unknowable in advance. We never know how it's going to come out. Now meaning is sought to be ordered and led and created and to become the end of concrete actions. And thus, for her, in this new world of historical processes, we lose the meaning. All we have is an unending chain of purposes. For her, we moderns escape the pain and frustration of meaninglessness, not through immortality of politics, not by creating an immortalized space where we can act, but by making history and making man into a means to an end, so that man is simply a means for the end of history. This is on 79. And on page 80, she writes, the end made, the communist utopia or the Aryan Reich or the environmentalist utopia, once that end is made, it cancels out and makes unimportant what came before it. All the particulars of history are meaningless in the face of this end product. Meaning is thus replaced by a pattern. And this is an important move in the essay, so I just want to flag it on page 80 and 81. Insofar as meaning is the whole, in order to make the world meaningful, we have to argue that the world actually does accord with our theory. Marx says that the theory is class struggle will lead to a communist utopia. And so you have to find patterns. You have to find class struggles that lead to more freedom, that then lead to more freedom, that lead to more freedom each time, and eventually will lead to a communist utopia. The point is, we now live at a time in which many different historians from many different schools of history are incredibly adept at looking upon the maze of chaotic facts in the world and finding patterns, right? I mean, just think about how much this will change with the emergence of artificial intelligent historians, right? All you have to do is say to this little ChatGPT historical process bot, right? Find, a pattern that shows that the whole world is made up of, things happening on odd number years or things like that. And just imagine the patterns that somebody can come up with. And so once you are able to come up with a theory and then look and cherry pick the facts of history to fit your pattern, historians can freely impose upon this maze of past facts almost any pattern they wish, as she writes on page 81. And what this means is that the factual and particular things are, in a sense, diminished and ruined by the seemingly higher validity of the general meaning or pattern. But here's the problem, is that saying this confuses pattern with meaning, right? Simply finding a pattern in history, right? White supremacy is a pattern in history. Rising equality could be a pattern in history. But simply finding a pattern doesn't mean that that's what makes the world meaningful. Kant, in his short essay on cosmopolitanism as an idea, says it will always remain bewildering that the early generations seem to carry on their burdensome business only for the sake of the latter, and that only the last should have the good fortune to dwell in the completed building. What that means is that all of us are simply stepping stones to a higher completed ideal of cosmopolitanism or world truth or Aryanism or communism or environmentalism or white supremacy or, plurality or whatever it is. And in telling the story of history, the chaotic particulars and experiences are turned into a meaningful story. And this is what she calls a reconciliation to reality. In some way, we reconcile with the chaos of reality by telling a story and making it humanly meaningful. And that's the Hegelian idea of world history, is to reconcile spirit and matter, ideas and the world. But Arendt's take on this is that this Hegelian project of reconciliation is destined to fail, and has indeed failed. And it's the failure of reconciliation that so much of her work addresses. That reconciliation is refuted, she says, by our experience as the simultaneous attempt of pragmatism and utilitarianism to make history and impose upon reality the preconceived meaning of law and man. That's on page 86. In the modern age, wherever man goes, she says, he encounters himself in nature and history. What this means is that man can make patterns as he will. And I think with artificial intelligence, you're going to start to see, even a greater attempt to do this than before. And everything thus is possible, not only in the realm of ideas, but in the field of reality itself. That's on page 87. I'm going to repeat that again because it's maybe the key idea here, right? It's actually based on the epigraph to the last part of The Origins of Totalitarianism, the book on totalitarianism, an epigraph taken by the author David Rousset, in which he says that men don't know that everything is possible. And it was one thing to say with the nihilists that everything is permitted, right? Morality is lost, therefore we can do whatever we want, everything's permitted. That's one crack in the tradition. Remember, this whole book takes place in this idea of the break in tradition that we've been talking about. But nihilism is only a minor problem for her compared to the major problem of the loss of historical fact and the victory of historical idealism. Because if you can take an idea and then find patterns in history and tell that as a story and make it meaningful, then everything is possible, not just in the realm of ideas, but in the realm of reality itself. And what this means is that we can begin to disregard factuality, that we can replace the factual world with a story about the world that's more meaningful than the factual world. And this is, again, one of her sort of psychological insights, is that most people will prefer a coherent, logical, factual story about the world than an incoherent, chaotic story about the world. And so if you tell a coherent story, and in order to do so, you have to erase some facts, kill some people, remove them from history books, lie about them. That's okay, because people have an interest in believing your more meaningful story than the incoherence of reality itself. And so every pattern leads to a consistent set of answers, which we then offer as meaning. We can take any hypothesis, right? White supremacy, black supremacy, Jewish supremacy. Take any one of them. And you can act on it and make a pattern that fits it and get a sequence of results in reality that both makes sense and works. And this is what she thinks totalitarianism is. She says on page 87, totalitarianism has a strange disregard for factuality based on the conviction that everything is possible. And it's not just permitted, right? Not just nihilism, not just morally permitted, as the case with nihilism. No, the totalitarian systems tend to demonstrate that action can be based on any hypothesis, and that in the course of consistently guided action, the particular hypothesis will become true, will become actual, factual reality. She says on page 87 to 88 that the actual hypothesis, right, white supremacy, black supremacy, Jewish supremacy, Asian supremacy, whatever it is, can be as mad as you please. But no matter what hypothesis you have, you can tell a story that makes it meaningful, and people will believe it because they want to believe a coherent narrative. What was originally, she says, nothing but a hypothesis to be proved or disproved by actual facts will, in the course of consistent lying, always turn into a fact, never to be disproved. All you need to do is, in a sense, keep telling the story over and over again, and the objective world and the facts that oppose that story disappear. And so on page 88, she says that the historian looks back into history and seeks to bring meaning and coherence and independence, a meaning and independence to bear, independent of the aims and awareness of the actors, so that he is liable to overlook what actually happened in his attempt to discern some objective trend. And of course, this is a critique that's often made of Marxist historians, that no matter what happens, they say that it's part of either the thesis or the antithesis or the dialectic, and it's always part of the history of a movement towards communism. And so the conclusion, she says, is that in process thinking of this kind of historical thinking, I can choose to do whatever I want, and some kind of meaning will always be the consequence. And then she brings it back on the last page, that this is all part of this turn away from the world, or world alienation. She says, in the situation of radical world alienation, neither history nor nature is at all conceivable. And that's where she leaves us at the end of this book. So again, the tradition has crumbled, right? The old myths that gave coherence to the world have fallen. That's for her both a danger and an opportunity. It's an opportunity because there's a chance for us to learn to think anew amidst this incoherence, amidst this chaos, and come up with new ways of living together. That's the promise. And this book, as what she calls exercises in thinking, is an attempt to train us to be up to that promise. The danger is that amidst the rubble of the tradition, instead of actually addressing the world as it is and trying to learn to live together, we embrace these theories, these processes, these stories that are simply fantasies, and we impose them on the world in such a way that we tell our own story about the world in ways that are non-factual and destroy reality and create either one totalitarian system or multiple warring, tribal, competing, factual realities, which is probably where we are today. Okay, I'll stop there. Like I said, this is a complicated book, a complicated essay, but it's part of this larger book, which is an about attempt to think, how do we think into this problem in a way that allows us optimistically to learn to live together amidst the rubble of our tradition, instead of imposing a kind of top-down story on it. Again, you all know the drill, or most of you do. There's a chat. You're welcome to interact with each other on the chat. It's very active. I love it. Be respectful to each other, please. You can disagree, but don't attack people for their as their person. You can also raise your hand down at the reaction button and engage the conversation with us. I always love it when new people get involved, and I know this is fairly early in a new book, and there's a lot of new people involved. So if you're interested, please join us, and I look forward to the discussion. Bernard, nice to see you.
Hello, thank you. This chapter, this essay, and the part we covered today, is delving into Marx in some detail of how Arendt regards Marx, and at least some of her assertions about Marx strike me as a caricature. I'm wondering if, in your own view, do you think Arendt gets Marx right? Is she ignoring too much of early Marx and the German ideology, places where, Marx is really celebrating the individual and saying that the individual is really the ultimate thing that matters, it's not just as some cog in a march towards communism. I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Bernard. It's a good question. Arendt loves reading Marx, clearly thinks, and in The Human Condition, she spends a lot of time on it. The part of Marx she's most interested in is the early Marx, right? So she reads the early Marx quite closely. What she's when she's talking about totalitarianism, right? Obviously, she's not talking about Marx. I should say obviously. So let me. When she's talking about totalitarianism, she's not talking about Marx. Marx himself was not a totalitarian. I don't want to pin that on Karl Marx, who was a brilliant thinker with an enormously influential, but also compassionate soul, I think, as far as what I know about him. So there is a way in which you're right, Bernard, that the jump from Marx to totalitarianism is not one where she's saying it's Marx's fault at all. So when we're talking about totalitarianism, we're not talking about Marx. We're talking about either Stalin or Hitler, or other people in that world. Um, that said, right, she does think that if you read Marx carefully and faithfully, um, there is a red thread of contradiction running through Marx, right? On the one hand, Marx is a thinker of freedom and the individual, as you rightly point out, and many people have tried to point out. And on the other hand, Marx is a thinker of class struggle, historical laws, dialectical materialism, um, and and Arendt thinks that um, the greatness of Marx as a thinker is this contradiction. Um, the tragedy of Marxism as a movement is um, uh, the loss of is the sacrifice of the humanist individualist Marx to the scientific political Marx. Um, and so to tell the story she's telling um, doesn't mean that Marx is this, it's this terrible, boring, totalitarian thinker. That's not the argument at all. But it is to say that Marx contained both these sides in him, and the attempt to put Marxism into practice leads to the same contradiction, which in Marxist societies or societies that have been influenced by Marx has been, for the most part, decided on the side of de-individualization, defactualization, and totalitarianism. Um, uh, so I hope that answers your question. I think she's right about Marx, and I think she's right about the way Marxism has evolved. But that's not in any way to say that Marx himself is at blame or not worth reading or a bad thinker. That's not her point at all. She loves Marx, and so do I. Reading Marx is an extraordinarily rich experience. Unfortunately, studying the attempts to implement Marxism is not so rich and extraordinary. Okay. I'm sorry. There we go. Joanne.
Uh, thanks, Roger. I have to start with an insight of postmodernism in terms of what you've been saying, and that is, if we're to reject the idea that somebody has a story to tell and they're going to make sense out of the events of the world, I would say that, well, there are some dangers in that. There are definitely dangers in having a pattern that you're going to try to find in the world. But every story has a storyteller, and that includes Hannah Arendt also telling this story, and it includes you telling Hannah Arendt's story. So I just want to put that out there. I do see the danger in patterns. I mean, though they can be too easily manipulated and simplistically applied. But if we step back from that, and we're trying to find meaning, I don't understand how we find meaning. What is meaning per se, if there is no meaning within context and within some kind of a story? Let's take a coal miner in the 19th or early 20th century. Their actions, going to work every day, to make the piddling amount of money they'll make for it. Does that mean that taking away, let's say, the Marxist pattern of oppression and class struggle, unionization, which of course came about with the United Mine Workers, should they step back from that whole process and just say, well, this is just me. I'm going to work in horrible conditions, and it's just to put a little bread on the table, and that will be the meaning of my life. I mean, what do we have if we don't have some sort of a context, or I don't want to use the word pattern because that's too easy,
Oh,
but
it's
I think
great.
you understand what I'm trying to.
I do. It's a great question, Joanne. So thank you for asking it, and I really appreciate it, actually. Um, so first of all, every story does have a storyteller, and Arendt um is a is a storyteller, and as you said, and thank you for saying it, because I like to think of myself as a storyteller. Um uh and storytelling is how we make meaning today and at all times to some degree. And for her, for Arendt, and I think she's right, making meaning is what humans are most in need of. So storytelling is a good thing for her, not a bad thing. I don't mean to have said. I hope I didn't say that it's a bad thing. What I wanted to say, and I'll repeat it, and I think hopefully maybe now with some different emphases based on your question, is that there are different ways to make meaning, right? Um, One way is to make meaning is through a political sphere, where you create a permanent political sphere that is going to last, and people of very different types and stripes and ideas and religions and interests clash, and know that they'll be remembered because the political um, preservation of our community. Another way to make meaning is through creating artwork or poetry, where you put something, a story or a poem or a painting or a dance into the world, right? And another way to make meaning is through ideas, telling a story, making a new idea, the cave analogy or such. Um, the Marxist story of oppression and class struggle is an important idea, important, and it gives meaning and sense to people's lives. The environmental story of the need to preserve the earth and have us be, is again a story that is very powerful and meaningful to many people. Um, uh, Simply telling stories um is not in itself dangerous, although any story is going to be partial, and insofar as it's a partial story, we'll have to leave certain facts and people and movements out in order to emphasize the story and the meaning you want to make. But that's part of what it means to be human. Her problem is not with telling stories and making meaning. Um, Her problem is that when um we tell stories that are supposed to be all encompassing, right? That are not just we're telling our story, but we're telling the story of history of the entirety of the human race. And this is true for everyone at all places, that the Aryans are going to rule, or white supremacy, or the communist utopia. These are not localized stories. These are stories that are supposed to tell about the necessary movements of historical laws. That's when they become dangerous. The movement itself, the story itself, is not necessarily dangerous, because there are many different stories, and the beauty of life is actually being able to not only listen to and tell many different stories, but inhabit many different stories, and to understand that as a coal worker, I'm also, I want to join a union and become part of that, but I'm also a a family member and a son or a daughter and a wife and a husband, and also a person in Pittsburgh or in China or wherever I am, and let those stories define me in many different ways. And so, from Arendt's point of view, um, all these stories are important, they're meaningful, but they also are limiting. We've lived in the West under dominant stories, right, of Christianity and liberalism, or and these traditions, she says, have limited our freedom to relate to each other in different ways. the crumbling of those traditions is freeing and allows us to explore new ways to live together. And yet the danger is that in the crumbling of those traditions, out of the fear of this chaos, people propose not just stories, but logical stories that exclude all other stories. And that's the problem that she's confronting.
That is helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. James.
Roger, I've really enjoyed this book. It's really triggered a lot of contemplation for me, and exploring new ways to live together sounds great to me. After she writes this, we have the internet, we have social media, we have the rise of all these new technologies, which accelerate what I think she's talking about in the epilogue. Yes? So, along those lines, this week I've been listening to J.D. Vance and Curtis Yarvin and Steve Bannon, basically it all flowing towards fill the zone with shit.
Towards what?
Fill the zone with shit.
Oh, no.
Right? So, and in doing such, they're repeating the story, and they're expecting people to live by these stories. Tear it down, tear it open.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, so there's a difference between a totalitarian story, right? Which is one that has to be pseudoscientific, right? So this is one of the core insights of her book, Origins of Totalitarianism, is that totalitarianism depends upon the victory of an ideology. In the two systems she looks at, one is the ideology of class struggle and Bolshevism, and the other is the ideology of racism, Aryanism, and anti-Semitism. And that these ideologies, there are other ideologies in the world, but those two, she says, Bolshevism and Aryanism, are two that have proven themselves capable of inspiring mass movements and having people believe that story, those patterns, in ways that they will ignore facts that disregard them. What you're talking about when you use the beautiful elocution of fill the zone with shit, is not an ideology, right? Not a pseudoscientific claim of where we're headed, but an expression of utter cynicism, as I understand it, that rejects the potential of any, that says that there are no facts that are meaningful enough to insist on, because all facts are made up by people trying to win you to their story or their account of the world. And as a result, you should disbelieve all facts and all stories, with the result that you just sort of resent and dispute and reject all authority and all meaning. Now, that is a precursor. What she does say in an interview she gives in the New York Review of Books very late in her life, so in the 1970s, she says that this this intentional intentional expression of and insinuation of cynicism is deeply dangerous, because if people don't believe anything, they can be manipulated to do almost anything, right? If they don't believe facts, if they don't believe any meaningful story, anyone who tells them a story, if it some way is convincing, can get them to follow along. That's not necessarily totalitarianism, because it's not, the stories that are being offered are not necessarily pseudoscientific stories that sort of tell a story good for all people. But it does lead to a kind of dispersed tribalism, dispersed polarization, where different people who are all cynical and basically don't believe that the world has meaning pick a story because their friends pick it, or because it's appealing to them, or because it will make them rich, or whatever, and stick to it. And when you tell them, how can to use, I'll try and come up with two different examples, but the easiest one, right, is, oh, January 6th was not a big deal, as Mr. Vance said, there was a peaceful transformation of power, or peaceful transition of power. And so, the story is, look, the liberals, they're going after Trump. These law cases, a lot of them are, made up. There's also a case against the current mayor of New York, Eric Adams. There's also a case against the senator in Pennsylvania, Mr. Menendez, and all these people. And what this just shows is that the legal establishment, if they're out to get someone, they can get someone. I mean, this is, any prosecutor will tell you this. If you want to get someone, if someone says, go get Roger Berkowitz, I guarantee you they can get Roger Berkowitz, right? And so the idea is that if you're going to use the legal system to go out and get individuals, you can always go out and get individuals. And that this shows the corruption of our legal system. And therefore, since it's corrupt, what does it really matter if we're corrupt too? Because everyone's corrupt. That I take that to be a large part of the argument by many of the people I know who are able to convince themselves to support the former president. And it's one based on, not that they believe what he's saying, but they believe that the whole system is corrupt. They're cynical, and therefore they might as well just pick the guy that's going to do the thing they want. Anyway, that's how I understand a lot of what's going on in the world, and there's a way in which this helps understand it, but it's less about processes and pseudo scientific ideologies today, and more about utter cynicism, and then people dividing into polarized tribal groups. That's about as good as I can do. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you. John Holt.
Hi, Roger.
Hi.
I'm trying to understand Arendt's notion of history without purpose, without end, without a providential God, and all of that. And to help me, I turned to a work by her mentor, Carl Jaspers. He wrote a book called The Origin and Goal of History, which seems to be pretty appropriate. And I couldn't find anything in their correspondence or any of her works in which she refers to Jaspers' notion of the goal of history. And he is the one in that book who coined the term the axial period, the period when Confucius and Lao Tse and Abraham or the Hebrew prophets and the Greek philosophers and so on all seemed to come to a certain common understanding, which he found extraordinary because they weren't communicating with one another. And so he sees that period as the origin of a set of values that are that reach across all cultures and all societies. All right. I want to read just a paragraph from Jaspers that I think might help. The word axis was not intended to convey the concealed interior around which the foreground of phenomena at all times revolves, that element which is itself timeless, but which extends through all ages and is enveloped by the dust clouds of the solely present. The appellation axis was bestowed rather upon an era around the middle of the last millennium BC, for which everything that preceded it would appear to have been a preparation, and to which everything subsequent actually, and often in clear consciousness, relates back. The world history of humanity derives its structure from this period. And then he ends by saying, he's talking about world unity based on continual talking to one another in our pluralistic world, continuing to talk with one another across different cultures to find a certain commonality. And the one word that he has to facilitate this is freedom, which is the opposite of a totalitarian concept of history. That's what I've come up with so far. I don't know if that helps, but what motivated me is that I'm disturbed by the notion that if we don't have some kind of an end or purpose of living, what is it that we live for? My own personal view is that we live to affirm our existence. That is, existence is good in itself. But I don't know how we can get other people to affirm that. All right, that's it.
Okay. Thanks, John. So that's it's really wonderful. Obviously, again, I should not use the word obviously. Jaspers and Arendt are super close. I don't know if they corresponded about the book, but she took his theory of the Axle Age very seriously. It's also his theory of communicative freedom. I think a few things to say about the Axle Age as you presented it very well. One is that it's a beginning, right? It's sort of both there's things that came before it, there's things that came after it, but it didn't emerge as out of a theory or out of a pseudoscience or an ideology. As you rightly said it, his theory or his view is that it emerged in 3 different places with different valences, different cultures. There were obviously huge differences between Confucian, Jewish, and Christian doctrines and ways of life, and yet there was certain similarities that they all were brought to bear. And so from his point of view, there's no science here. There's no scientific unfolding of a theory of history that someone can know and bring to its conclusion. It's free in the sense that now when you have Confucian cultures and Jewish cultures and Christian cultures and others, they have to talk to each other and find their similarities, but also find their differences and build a common world. And Arendt, I think, very much is in line with Jaspers. I mean, not to say that she fully buys, I don't know. I mean, she never writes about it that I know of, and that she fully buys his story of the axial age or not. But she certainly finds the moral he takes from it, right? Which is that history is something that has to be made in the acts from people doing things, talking to each other, in which the outcome is unknown. that's to her a free approach to living together. Whereas people saying, I know the one true history and it's true for all people, and we're going to help that history be imposed because we want to speed it up, that is not. The last thing you said about that, the one thing we live for is for existence. I would, that's something I find problematic. That's just personal. To me, that's very much the human rights story that's being told, right? That the purpose of man, the meaning of man is to live. And therefore, I think this has led to all sorts of disasters, where we have decided to, as a as a as an international culture, prioritize life over meaning. And in the human rights world, that means creating an entire new population in the world of refugees, of people that we would rather keep alive in often inhumane conditions, deprive them of their rights to fight for their freedom and their meaning, give them food, and in a sense bribe them to live increasingly meaningless lives. I think Arendt is someone who is very critical and skeptical of this, and I've been convinced by her on that regard. I just turn you to page 79 at the top. I skipped over this in my presentation, even though it's one of my favorite passages, and I just didn't think I had the time to do it. And I'm glad you're giving me, John, the chance to come back to it. She says, it is as though men were stricken suddenly blind to fundamental distinctions, such as the distinction between meaning and end, between the general and the particular, or grammatically speaking, the distinction between the for the sake of and the in order to. As though the carpenter, for instance, forgot that only his particular acts in making a table are performed in the mode of in order to, but that his whole life as a carpenter is ruled by something quite differently, namely an encompassing notion of for the sake of, which he became a carpenter in the first place. We today are all too eager to say that we live in order to live,
Pero es que,
and that we've forgotten the forsake of.
may I jump in, Professor Roger?
Yes, just give me 10 more seconds.
Okay.
Which goes back to page 27, where she says that in the break of tradition, when it actually occurred, we are in a position now where we can no longer, we hear a ominous silence that still answers us whenever we dare to ask, not what are we fighting against, but what are we fighting for? And this is, I think, one of the overarching themes of the book, which is that we're fighting against a lot of things. We're fighting against murder, totalitarianism, Bolshevism, Aryanism, racism, anti-Semitism. But we have lost very much this capacity to think, what are we fighting for, absent pseudoscientific ideological arguments. And that's what this book in many ways is calling us to do, is to, as John put it, speak to each other, talk to each other amidst freedom, across cultures, across divisions, in a way that somehow we remind ourselves not only what we're fighting against, not only that we're living in order to live, but what are we fighting for? Okay, I'm sorry. You can interrupt for a second now, Clara.
Okay, thank you, Professor Roger. I was just going to say that I agree with you in the sense that it's not just living for the sake of living, but my previous colleague make a difference because he said for the sake of existence, and that's make a difference. And it also makes a difference because Aaron insists that there is a difference between just living for living, like a natural process, and existence, because existence means meaning, and that's a whole difference.
Yeah, I mean, if you mean by existence, not just living, but living for a particular purpose, then yes, I heard it differently, but maybe I just heard it wrongly. So, in any case, it allowed me to say something I wanted to say, so I'll stick to it.
And could I simply just one final thing? You misunderstood me when I said just for existence, mere existence.
Okay.
No, the point is to live, to be able to affirm one's existence despite all the suffering
Okay.
and difficulties. Still, what leads us to affirm existence as good? That's all, and that we can get other people to do the same. That is, to create conditions in which other people can do the same to affirm life as good. That's all.
Great. No, then thank you. Then you and Clara
Great.
are right. Ken.
Thanks, Roger. I first want to say I'm finding this book frighteningly relevant right now. In fact, I might even say I think it's more relevant right now with the particular threat to democracy that we're seeing in the next month than at any other time in my lifetime that I can think of. And I think it gets more and more relevant from here on as we read the book. I'm glad I'm bouncing back a little bit to what you're talking about with James, because that it's on my mind, and I think it's going to become increasingly relevant as the book goes on. And just one thing you said, Roger, you said it kind of twice, which is that we've degenerated to polarized tribal groups. And I think there's truth in that, but I also think it's really important to note the distinction between the sort of realities we're saying, the competing realities or the tribal groups, namely that one is fact-based and one is not. And you brought up Tim Walz, and I'm thinking of the debate this week. You know, Vance seemed very coherent. You know, it was based on a coherent fiction. He wasn't bothered by facts at all. And Walz got across some facts and wasn't very persuasive. And up to this point, I think the whole Trump movement has had a very coherent fiction that has been very persuasive. And there's an advantage to that. She talks about it less in this book, I think, than in others, but that a fictional reality, and you mentioned it already, that a fictional reality is much more easy to communicate than a fact-based one. And I'm just very wary of every time they're equated, like when this debate is talked about like two reasonable people getting together, talking to each other, because that's not the case. It was interesting. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up, just in relation to what you were talking about, is that it's interesting now to see Trump becoming completely incoherent and still not losing followers. So the fiction is turned to just an emotional basis, as far as I can see, and left this sort of coherent fiction, but it's still very persuasive for I guess 50% of the voters from the polling. And she doesn't talk really about the emotional basis too often. She talks about taste quite a bit, but I just wanted to bring those things up. I also, I know we're going to talk about this later. I don't think that because it's fiction-based that Trump is a totalitarian. I think he's a tyrant. And I know we'll talk about these different forms of government next week. And I also wanted to offer that on page 98 and 99, she talks about, we're not there yet, she talks about the different images of several different governments. And I'm sorry I'm not going to be here next week, but I made a chart of those governments here. And if anyone wants it, just email me. It's my name at gmail.com.
Thanks, Ken. No, I mean, Ken, I think I've seen that chart before and it's great. So, we can maybe share it. Everything you said, is very important. You know, I hesitate to whether I want to get into the can of worms of whether both sides are fact-based or not. Uh, 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 I mean, there are, you know, I think we all know that people on both sides are play loose with the facts. That doesn't mean that it's equal, right? And I think that, Ken, you're right, that it's important not to simply say, oh, they're the same. I think that's an important point. All I'll add to that is that, even if they're not equal, there's many people, good people, who I think are fairly knowledgeable, who are so convinced that both sides are fully embracing fictions, that they almost don't care anymore. And that's the cynicism that, I find emerging. You know, again, I don't want to go into it too much because I generally share much of your viewpoint. But if I were to tell you that when I've really pushed my friends on who share different viewpoints to come up with things, they'll talk about things like the Hunter Biden laptop, which has still not really been admitted to and addressed, the way in which the press completely suppressed that story before the last election. They'll talk about the Russiagate thing and the way that, you know, even though there's been no evidence that Russia intervened, many people still continue to think that, that the 2016 election was illegitimate because of that. And so they'll tell you that there are, factual things that people on, the Democratic Party side of the world, simply, will not, address or accept. I don't want to get into it here. I'm just trying to say that I know some, you know, I don't think there's an equivalence. I think it's not equivalent, but I think what's matters for our political world is that there are enough things that both sides simply refuse to accept in their factual nature because it frustrates their narrative, that the result is that much of the electorate simply has contempt for both sides, which is creating an enormous amount of cynicism, which allows a whole new level of, factual manipulation to occur. And so I'll just leave it at that without endorsing any of that. Just saying that I think that, I think it's true that that's happening, whether it's justified or not. Donna. And good morning, Donna.
Good morning, Roger. Yes,
What
dawn is
time is
about
it?
about 4:30 Saturday morning. So dawn
Oh
is
my
about
God.
to break
Oh my
here in
God.
Brisbane. That's okay, thank you. And notwithstanding the importance of your discussion just now, beyond America's borders, I do want to take us off on a different track, if I may. As you'll be aware, but perhaps not others, my tradition is more in East Asia, particularly Japan. What I'm looking at doing with next year is, of course, the 80th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so I want to use Arendt's particular concept of history to try and make some meaning of that, to draw out what she has said, largely in passing, about the atomic bomb and the importance to her, I guess, as setting an idea of history. And so for me, this chapter is particularly important in that respect. Now, Arendt is very popular in Japan. You can go into the major bookshops and find large bookshelves set aside for her work. Nearly all her work is translated into Japanese, either from the original German or from the English versions. Lots of scholars now are writing a lot about Arendt, looking through an Arendtian lens to look at a whole range of issues. And so she's well known, quite well regarded in Japan, I guess. And for me, as part of my work, I'm more political scientist than historian, but to try and look at what she talks about with the atomic bomb and what that meant, and try and draw that out. And that's why this chapter in particular is important, as well as her other work. And I was just wondering, just on page sort of the bottom of 86 to 87, where she talks about the question of academic objectivity and so on, and then goes on to say, if nothing more was involved, then we would be satisfied that different questions put to one and the same physical event, and of course there I'm thinking of Hiroshima, reveal different but objectively equally true aspects of the same phenomenon, just as the table around which a number of people have taken their places is seen by each of them in a different aspect. This also has a kind of a Kurosawa, the filmmaker, director Kurosawa's Rashomon element about it that I'll be bringing into that. But have I kind of misunderstood this passage here of hers? That is she saying that objectivity is something that takes away our understanding of history, or is it important that we have those different points of view with trying to understand? Because obviously how people in Hiroshima that I've been working with over the years see that atomic bomb obviously has quite a different story to the way it's told from the American point of view, for example, or even the Australian point of view. I mean,
Right.
as I said, it's still in its early stages, but trying to understand that with her concept of history is to me quite important.
So this comes back. Thank you, first of all, Donna, and thanks for getting up so early to join us. This goes back to I forget who asked it before about the different men. I think Joanne, the different kind of storytelling that there is in the world. And you know, of course, if you sit an American down and a Japanese down from 1945, and an American and Japanese today, and maybe other people down, and you ask them about the dropping of the atom bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you're going to get, you know, I mean, to some degree, different accounts. Some might agree on certain things and disagree on others. And in some sense, this is just perspectivalism, right? You sit around the table, everyone has their own perspective. And that in itself is not a problem. You know, the idea would be that we may disagree on the meaning of the bomb and whether it was dropped out of racism or dropped out of a desire to save lives, or whether it is, you know, or other reasons. But we agree that the bomb was dropped, right? And we agree on that not only was the bomb dropped, that there were certain tragic consequences of it and things like that. And that's the difference between facts and opinions. For her, what is undermining, as she says further down the page, what is really undermining the whole modern notion that meaning is contained in the process as a whole, from which the particular occurrence derives its intelligibility, is that not only can we prove this in the sense of consistent deduction, but we can take almost any hypothesis and act on it. What undermines the kind of faith in a common world that you're talking about, if I understand you, Donna, is not that there are different perspectives, but that we can take almost any perspective and try and prove it. And insofar as we then prove it, we make it into a logical correlation. So if we were to say, look, we didn't drop the bomb because we didn't like Japanese or devalue Japanese lives. We dropped the bomb because we wanted to save both American and Japanese lives by ending the war earlier. And you can make this argument, and you can find all these statements, and you can find all these facts and figures and studies. And then anything that refutes that, you sort of ignore or erase or try and argue against and destroy those facts. And you try and make your argument coherent. That's the dangerous part of what she's talking about. Not the fact that there are different perspectives and different opinions. So I don't know if that helps, but that's what I think she's after here.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you. All right, we're running out of time, and I got 2 questions left. Try and keep them very quick, Bruce and John.
Yes, thank you very much, Roger. I simply wanted to note an aspect of Between Past and Future that's always struck me in reading it, and that is the sense that Arendt has, not just about the difference between the alienation from the world of praxis and the modern utopian teleological kinds of things, but the idea that we have, to a disabling degree, forgotten and lost what the concepts of classical political theory meant, and the potential that they have within them still, if we could recover the conception and undo some of the conceptual loss that has taken place. And so to me, that is a very fruitful and interesting way to look at what Arendt is up to here. And I think in The Human Condition, she quotes Harrington about ransacking the archive of ancient prudence.
Yeah. So, Bruce, because we're short on time, I'll just say thank you, but also, there's a way in which I think you're right, and a way in which I'm a little worried. I mean, I think she's more radical in that. I mean, she doesn't want to ransack the history of political theory to find a new political theory. She wants to accept the fact that the tradition is broken. She doesn't want to bring it back. I mean, I think one of the most mistaken critiques of Arendt that you hear often is that she has nostalgia for the Greeks or something like that. There's no nostalgia in Hannah Arendt. She finds things of value in the Greeks and in the Romans and in the Christians and in the Jews and in the Chinese and in the, I mean, she ransacks history not for like a new theory, but for things she finds interesting. But the goal here is to accept and even celebrate the break in tradition, the crumbling of tradition, and say this could be really dangerous, but it could also be a great opportunity. And to try and think, how would we think positively and optimistically in this world? So, but yes, we do have to ransack history in order to find interesting ideas that will help us.
Yeah, thank you. And just one last thought. What I really am trying to get at is her understanding of the relationship between past, present, and future. I think, and that's not a question of coming up with a new political theory. It's more a question of how we live in the present, either in touch with the past and in touch with the possibilities of the future or not.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. John, we're out of time. Can you want to make a quick statement, or are you, or not?
I think it can be quick. Are we really, are we talking about that dialogue is where we want to be? Because if the ends can lead so easily to tyranny and totalitarianism, and just looking at the means, we can have different narratives, different perspectives. Is the essence of where we want to be is dialogue?
The essence, I don't know, but certainly talking amongst ourselves, both for Jaspers and Arendt, is at the very core of their political project. So whether that's the essence or not, it's certainly central to it. Okay, that said, thank you all. This was a complicated chapter. The next chapter we're reading is What is Authority, which is one of the more brilliant and wonderful of her essays. Are we reading the whole thing for next week, Yana? Do you remember?
No, just part one.
Just part one. Okay. So
And
we'll
then
read.
part two after the conference.
So for part one for next week, and that's a good reminder. If you haven't yet registered for the conference, we'd love to see you here. I know there'll be a lot of people from the reading group at the conference, and it's always a lot of fun to see in person some of these people you're spending so much time with. So I hope you can make it. Conference is the 17th and 18th. Next week, we'll read What is Authority, Part 1. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you next week. Thanks very much.